Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to be here. We've already had so many interesting conversations and fascinating insights that I'm actually really unsure, what I can add. I feel ill-equipped to answer the question. And I guess I'll start by saying, is it an answerable question? It raises, I think, some key assumptions that have already been sort of put on the table and questioned by many speakers about the nature of transformations, particularly in times of complexity, where there are multiple actors, where there's evolutionary change, where there's no starting point that we can identify, and therefore, what are we looking at when we're looking at who initiates? But nonetheless, I will try and say something about this. I think it might come across as some somewhat disconnected points and reflections, hopefully some provocations, but trying to understand a little bit in different contexts what elements initiate, trigger something that we recognize, usually ex post, as transformation. I think the more important, if you like, social science question is always, under what circumstances do these things take place? I would also just say, I was introduced as being at UNRISD, the UN Research Institute for Social Development. So I'm not now, it's a research institute. I'm not an academic. I'm in a different location. And one where I think, I'll come back to this at the end a bit, where we really need to ask, what role do these kind of spaces, a space within the UN, which is currently discussing somewhat in a tiresome way, I would say, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals as a transformative agenda. So that language is already out there. In the UN context, it's probably already in this process of being rapidly devalued. And I think that is something I'll come back to at the end. But for now, I've been through different institutional locations, so I'm going to just reflect a little bit on my own different areas of work to try and get at this question. I first studied history, and we've already had several eloquent speakers about the value of history, the role of history, and the need to have a historical perspective. I think we can only answer the question, what or who does something, if we're looking at it as something that's happened in the past. So we need that historical perspective. We also need history, I think, because we need narratives of our past and of what's happening in the present, and something that we can take into the future. And that point has already been made. We need, through history, to sort of fix some kind of key facts or dates or whatever in order to make sense of a story of what's unfolding and what's changing. It may be a story without a beginning, without knowing where it's ending, but there's also, of course, depending where we are now and depending what our interests are now, we rewrite that history. We debate what the origins of wars and revolutions, etc. are. So looking back, we will also have different interpretations in order to use them for where we are now and where we want to go. And I think, this point about narratives has been raised many times, but I think it's a key issue of what initiates, engineers these transformations. Probably the narrative is actually a very key part of that. And I think there are actually some examples, which I won't go into now, but we can come back to, where there have been very deliberate attempts to create alternative narratives to the mainstream. Particularly, I think you see it with the Keynesian to economics, where there was a combination of funders, ideas, institutions, all trying quite deliberately to engineer a transformation in terms of economic structures and thinking and policies. So that was my first point on history. My second point is on the area that I work on, my own research, when I was a researcher and a social scientist rather than what I am now, is on China. And of course, I write, and I've written probably for the last 10 to 15 years on the huge transformation and transformations that have taken part in China. My own research has been on the social consequences, the costs, the distributional issues, often the reversals, for example, in areas of gender and health and other things, that have come along with this massive economic change. I think and I should say I've been working in China since the mid-80s. And so in the early period, in the late 80s, early 90s, if I look back on that period, the terminology that was being used was reform and opening. There wasn't a sense that this was going to be a transformation. It wasn't clear what was going to happen. Maybe Deng Xiaoping knew in his mind, he had a vision. It's clear that there was some serious vision of change. But it was still about a very poor country, gradually opening up, experimenting. It was a quite cautious approach. And of course, there was leadership, there was the party and the state, in a sense, guiding and managing. But there was also quite a lot of bottom-up change. There were local government actors, there were collective actors, there were farmers, peasants doing their thing and making change at the grassroots. All of these things were creating policy space, change, innovation, which later on we could look back on and say this was part of a transformative process. I think it was only in the early 90s, maybe a bit earlier, but I think particularly probably in the post-1989 world, the fall of the war, the end of the Cold War, the end of history, when social scientists working on China, Western social scientists in particular, started talking about transition. It still wasn't transformation, it was transition. And of course, I haven't gone back to really review all of the literature in this, so this is a little bit reflecting on what the language was being used. You also saw a shift in the Chinese language being used by Chinese scholars. And so then it was transition. It was going from the plan to the market. There was some sense of what they were going from to by then. It was going to be a, market socialism and a socialism with different characteristics, etc., Chinese characteristics. But there was more of an idea that there was a process now that was a bit clearer in the direction, that it was moving towards a market transition. And perhaps more optimistically, at some point, obviously, also potentially towards a more liberal, open, more democratic polity. And I think by then, particularly by the late 90s, you saw also the emergence of stronger civil society pushing for change, particularly social change in different directions. So I think what you see there is, again, it's hard to say what or who initiated. You can see state-led, state-guided change, planning being a key policy tool. You can see pragmatism, experimental responding to problems that arise, piloting innovations. No blueprint, very much an experimentation with what was recognized as a very huge, complex system. The main transformation, of course, that didn't happen, and probably the one occasion where if it had had a different outcome, we might be looking back and said, yes, it was students, it was a social movement that made change, was, of course, Tiananmen in June the 4th that ended the student movement that ended in tragedy. And so, of course, history, I think we would be interpreting much of that history differently if that had had a different outcome. We'd have a different story to tell. Of course, today also we now see the environmental tragedy as well as more of the social costs of these transformations. And so I guess what I'm saying is it's a complex story and very hard to say who and what. But nonetheless, you can identify different actors in this process. Sorry, how much time? I now want to just turn briefly to where I am now in UNRISD, in the Research Institute. And we have a sort of strapline, Research for Social Change. And I guess there's, our mandate and what we're trying to do, and what we've been trying to do for 50 years, is to bring the social dimensions of what were then primarily economic reform planning processes, bring the social dimensions more centrally into the work of the UN system. And so our goal is to bring together researchers, research ideas, to coordinate research across many countries, across disciplines, and it is multidisciplinary, in order to provide one of those bridges we were hearing about, to get ideas, research, evidence into the global policy agenda. Hopefully it's also used back down to the national and local level by the researchers we work with. I think some of the work on that, just to give a quick illustration, I think one body of work has actually been about social policy and what we call, and have for a long time, termed transformative social policy. And by transformative social policy, we've meant that social policy has multiple functions, and that if you if you look at the welfare states in particular, Western Nordic models, but also to some extent East Asian models, different kinds of social policies can have multiple functions, and because they have multiple functions across the protection element, redistribution element, but also links with the productive economy and reproduction, you end up having a more transformative effect on the economic and social structures, particularly, for example, through linking productive and protective and reproductive roles. I think that's very different from what we're seeing now, the reversal towards social policies which are very targeted. Their only function is a very narrow protective function. They have very little link with the productive sectors. And so in that sense, we were talking about social policy being transformative. But I think that the history of that and what led us to understand social policy in this sense was looking at welfare states. And for some parts of the world, mainly the Western welfare states, the North, there was a remarkable collective outcome, I think, as part of what we heard, the Great Transformation, a response to many of the problematic consequences of industrialization and capital, was the creation of welfare states. And it was a creation which, again, we can see leaders, Bismarck, Beveridge, as important actors. But I think we also have to recognize the role of collective organizing. And here, I think we've touched on this quite frequently today. The issue of the workers, peasants, other middle-class alliances that form to create the kinds of welfare states, which vary, but had a base in the shared interests around insecurity, around overcoming insecurities, around dealing with the social consequences, around life course issues, pensions, healthcare, etc. I think one of the big questions now is, could that be reproduced in a world where we've got casualized labor, we've got much more dispersed identities, we have fewer opportunities where identities come together around this common shared agenda. And I think that's a debate that's out there. There are people doing research on those issues. But I think this capacity to organize, the capacity to express shared interests, the dismantling of some of the institutions that enable that to happen is something. Obviously, we have new institutions, social media, the internet, etc. So it means that it's a very different kind of world. I think finally, sorry, I've run out. I forgot to check my time. Okay. I just want to say then finally, in response to these UN processes around the next global development agenda, again, I've mentioned that I think there's a process of devaluation already about the notion of transformation in these contexts. We're talking about a transformative vision, or people are, a transformative agenda. But of course, the agenda gets down to then the goals and then the measurement, and I think it comes to the quantitative-qualitative shift. Then we get down to targets and indicators and how we're going to measure them. So immediately we're moving away from the sort of transformative vision of what can be achieved to something that we can actually measure. We're also talking in that context, and somebody's mentioned this, of triple win, of all of these goals being able to generate multiple wins, rather than really looking carefully at the synergies, the trade-offs, the ways in which these different goals interact. And so I think the challenge is to put the empirical evidence and the kind of evidence that we can get from this kind of context in to be able to go from the local context up to the global context, to see, is there a role for this kind of normative standard setting, which is what the UN should be doing as a major role, and can this in itself be a space or a site for transformation, and what would it take to use that space, to make that space actually part of this kind of endeavor towards transformation and towards transformative change. I had a set of reflections about then who are the actors based on a long list, but I think I'll leave that then for further discussion. Thank you.